Hello and welcome to Fat Squirrel Speaks. Today is almost the end of March and this is a bonus episode. So I'm your hostess, Amy Beth, also known as The Fat Squirrel on Ravelry or The Fat SQRRL on Instagram. This is not a regular episode, so there won't be shenanigans or talk or anything like that. This is a bonus episode, and I'm basically going to do an after-party. So I'm going to talk about a recently finished object that I have that I made some changes to, and so I thought I would tell you about them here in a condensed bonus episode. So if you're planning to knit this sweater, it might be helpful to watch. Or really, if you're knitting any sweater, I think some of the things will be applicable to you too, especially if you're, for example, turning a pullover into a cardigan, and things like that. So these bonus episodes are all thanks to folks who financially contribute to the podcast via Patreon or PayPal. So great big thank you to those folks. If you'd like to find out more about donating to the podcast, which I would really appreciate, donating's not the right word. If you'd like to find out more about paying for the podcast as something that you enjoy and want to continue to support, you can find information at patreon.com/thefatsquirrel, and I'll put a link in the show notes as well. Okay. So this is the Afterparty. It is a pattern by Astrid Troland. Now that I say that, I'm not entirely sure. Yes, that is correct. And it is in Lane magazine, which apparently is like Lane. I don't know. But they said, the folks who make Lane said they're okay with that pronunciation, so I'm going to go with it. And this is their number 6 issue, which I purchased from the Woolly Thistle. Okay, so this one has lots of great patterns in it, but the Afterparty is the reason I purchased it. However, I will also say I'm quite tempted. I can't believe I'm telling you this. I am so tempted to make this stupid bobble sweater. It's out of control. Eden Yarn Fest has just wrapped up and I saw so many folks in this sweater, the Arbusto by Rosa Pomar. Did you see everybody in their photos? What is wrong with me? What is bobbles? It's bobbles all over. I was telling my friend Corey, I was like, this looks beautiful on everyone, but when I make it, it's gonna look like I have skin tags. So definitely note to self, no pinks or peaches in this sweater. Like my things are gonna come out, like my bobbles are not gonna be like perfectly spherical. They're gonna get like flattened and weird. And then I'm gonna be like, why did I ever do this? But I am so stinking tempted. I'm not gonna knit it as is. I'll see, I'm already telling you I'm gonna do it. I'm going to knit it short sleeved because definitely I cannot have bobbles rubbing against bobbles. That I think is very bad for for me. I think though I want to knit it cropped with short sleeves. Oh my gosh, what's wrong with me? But anyway, that's just to say there is another thing in this magazine that I want to make. Eek! So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is, hey, I'm super satisfied with how this sweater turned out. Here is a clip of me with it on my actual human body. So here is the sweater on. Front view, side view, back view. What do I want to say when it's on me? So, things that I'm not in love with. I should have another 1/2 inch of ease in these sleeves. Because they hug enough that, you just get more conformity than I would regularly want in a regular cardigan. That said, it's not bad. It's not uncomfortable at all. It doesn't feel like it's so snug. Sometimes you get a yoke sweater that does feel really snug, like you can't, and it doesn't feel like that at all. I just should have added some more ease in the sleeve, but, I don't do a lot of sleeves. I gotta be honest with you. So here it is. I mean, I don't know. Does it matter to you what it looks like when it's unbuttoned versus buttoned? There it is, completely unbuttoned. Ta-da! So yeah, I guess you can see the neckline better where it hits. This is a t-shirt with the collar still on. I have very few of them in my life, but I haven't actually mutilated this one, so it kind of gives you an idea of where it would hit. So yeah, I think it looks pretty good. There might, you might see a slight, usually your, often your gauge is tighter in your stranded colorwork, so sometimes the sweater will ask for a decrease here. I did not do it, in fact kept increasing for bust, or I'm sorry, it was bottom up, so I kept decreasing at that point. Sorry, I couldn't think right. But it doesn't have any sort of ruffling at all on. When it lays flat, you can see a little bit of a bubble in the bust area, but that's just because of the increases, I think. So if you've seen a picture of it laying like on a table, I think I put one on Instagram, it does have a little bit of that look in the front, but as you can see when it's on, it doesn't have any issues. It also might give you an idea of where the color work is on the sleeve on a human. So yeah. Okay, so these are the things I'm going to talk about. Okay, first of all, I love this aesthetic. I love the way it looks. I would not recommend this pattern for a new knitter. Not because of the stranded color work or whatever. That's something that you can totally conquer as a newer knitter. Just need a little practice. But because of the lack of good measurements and a schematic, that's the reason I don't recommend it for new knitters, especially new knitters who cannot typically buy off the rack. So if you find that you're typically, maybe you have a bigger arm or a smaller arm or a narrower shoulder or a wider shoulder than the straight middle of the path fit, it makes it much more complicated to adjust the fit without a good schematic. So I don't recommend it for new knitters. If you love this look, then what I would tell you is to do a different pattern that does have a schematic, that's a yoke sweater, and just paste these colorwork charts onto that sweater. That's a little bit complicated, but you can do it if you're actually inspired to do so. That's it. So that's the thing. That's the first thing I want to say. And really, it's my complaint for the sweater. My main complaint is that there are not good schematics. And this is the first time I've ever purchased Lane. And it kind of looked like that's the case throughout their publication, which is rather disappointing, to be honest. So that is a disappointment that I have with this specific issue. I'm assuming that is, that's likely to be standard for them. So that would be great if that could be adjusted, but sometimes that's just what you get. So, for example, I would probably not buy another one of their magazines without being able to actually touch it and check to see if there were schematics. Or, in fact, I could just email the Woolly Thistle and they would probably be happy to check for me, because that's what buying from a small business is all about, is that excellent customer service. Sorry, I'm totally sneaking coffee as we're talking. So, okay, then let's start. See, here's my list of things, and I unnumbered them. So let's see, that was number 1. Okay, so number 2, ease. So now in terms of ease, the pattern is written to have 4 to 6 inches of positive ease. I do not typically like the fit of a sweater when it has that much positive ease in it. I don't know if it's just being a fat person and like having a past where you were supposed to cover your body, and now, and then I went to the other extreme of that where like everything was super form-fitting, almost like as a rebellion thing. So now I'm kind of like settling somewhere in the middle where I do like a slightly fitted look, but not a constrictive feel to a garment. So, I did not do 4 to 6 inches of positive ease. I do typically when I'm knitting sorry, I'm not on a great surface. When I am doing a cardigan, I will give myself positive ease. Lots of times in a pullover, I will actually give my bust negative ease because, again, knitwear has so much stretch to it, and because of my circumference, the percentage of stretch ends up yielding a greater number of inches of stretch. Just mathy. But in a cardigan, I do like to have 0 inches to usually 2 inches of ease, positive ease, because of buttons. Now, I don't wear my sweaters buttoned a lot, but lots of times I button like the 3 to 4 buttons that are right across the bust line. And so I don't want to feel like those are really pulling. So that's why I have a little bit of positive ease in this sweater versus a pullover, which I often do a little bit of negative ease. Let's see. Oh, I do it. My fit complaint is that my sleeve is a little bit snug. And again, that would have been helpful to have a good schematic so that I could tell. But ultimately, I'm an experienced enough knitter that I can, calculate my gauge and how many stitches that are indicated for the sleeve, because usually I'm adjusting because I know I need more room in my sleeve. However, I did make a mistake. The combination of the less elasticity in the yoke because of the stranded color work, combined with, I have recently actually, as I tried this sweater on and realized that the sleeve was snugger than I really wanted it to be, I realized that I've been making short sleeve sweaters. Lots of my sweaters are short sleeve sweaters. And then the last sweater I made that was long sleeve, I made the sleeve a little too big. And so I think I just and I had made several short sleeve sweaters with the sleeve a little too big. And so I think that came together to make me think, okay, I need less stitches for my sleeves. I need less room in my sleeve. But I think what really is happening is that on a short sleeve sweater, I actually do need negative ease in the sleeve, because like the hem of a sweater, you want usually about -2 inches of ease in the hip of a sweater, so that your sweater does not bell out at the bottom just from natural stretch. But that kind of helps it to stay conformed. It's not that huge percentage increase that you get with like Elizabeth Zimmerman percentage sweater, where traditionally, you did your ribbing and then you increased like 10% of your stitches or something wild like that to the body. So it's not that drastic where you're getting like a blousing effect or a ballooning effect at the hem. It's just enough to kind of keep it pulled in against your body, especially if you're not doing a ribbing. If you're doing like a hemmed hem, or like a moss stitch or something like that for the bottom. So I realized I need to apply the same concept to a short sleeve sweater, that I need to have negative ease in that short sleeve sweater. But if I'm doing a full sleeve, that's not the case. So actually this sleeve has pretty much, as I measured it, has about a -1 inch of ease. And so that's a little bit snugger than I really want it, especially to wear over other clothing. But that's just obviously a personal preference. It doesn't make the sweater uncomfortable. It just makes me slightly more aware of the sweater on my body at this point. That's actually not a bad thing. If you had a particularly heavy sweater, it might help to anchor it onto your body a bit more, but this sweater is woolen spun, light, and that's not an issue. So that is ease, I think, as far as the sweater goes. Okay, number 3. I did do bust and hip shaping. This is a bottom-up sweater, which I have not done in forever, right? Which is another thing, I think, reason I had a little bit of more stress at the sleeve area. But I did do both hip and bust shaping. So I did hip increases, I hit hip decreases in the back, because my hips are significantly wider than my waist. I did not give myself, for example, let's say I have a 60-inch hip. Let's say I have a 54-inch waist. I did not do 6 inches of decreases because I didn't want a super form-fitting hourglass fit, but I did do some decreases. Usually I do about 4 inches of decreases from my fullest hip up into the waist. And sometimes they actually overlap. So while I may be decreasing on the back for the hip, I might start to increase on the front for the bust, depending on the length of the sweater. Now this one's fairly long, so there was no overlap. I definitely did my hip decreases, knit a few inches, and then started my bust decreases. And the way you can find that out, or like, how you do that, is just to measure, how long you want this part, I knit mine longer than the pattern, but that's obviously the easiest thing you can adjust in a sweater. Figure out how long you want this. Figure out where you need your waist shaping to stop. So, you know, if this is like a super long tunic, then I'm not going to do all of my hip shaping right at the bottom because it's not going to hit my waist for several inches. But, you know, you figure out where you need your waist shaping to stop, figure out how far this is, and work in how many decreases you need to do. And the same is true for the bust. You know, obviously you want the fullest of your bust. Usually they typically recommend that you stop doing bust increases 2 inches below the bust. You can get away with 1 inch below the bust. You don't usually want to be increasing right up to the bust because it can be more visible. Obviously, if it's under the bust, you're not seeing it as much. If you have increasing right on that fullest bust line, it's much more visible. So again, you just figure out how much room do I have to get those increases in and plan accordingly. So, and you can find out more information about that in many places. But Amy Herzog is always a good resource for that. Let's see. So definitely did hip decreases because it's bottom up, hip decreases, bust increases. Okay. So then, now number 4. Oh, didn't do that. Number 5. Okay, so the other thing I have changed that's pretty significant is that the pattern as written, okay, I wrote it down here. I wanted to make sure I get that information correct for you. The pattern as written, obviously for my size, so I'm a 56-inch full bust, and I think this pattern, let's see, the smallest size is a 37, so that's 19 inches difference. Between me and the 37, I need a lot more room from here to here, right? Just mathematically how that's going to work. There's lots of different ways designers can make that up, especially in a color work. You have to be more aware of it than you would in a texture or a solid pattern. So the way this designer chose to get more depth for the plus size, or for my size, is to put more rows, more solid color, more rest rows in between the motifs, especially right here. So, for example, the size small has 2 rounds of solid color between this motif and this motif. The largest size has 9 rounds. That's over 1 inch difference. Like, you know what I mean? So that aesthetically is a different look to me. Especially since in the small size, there are equal number of rest rows between this and this. Like these are both equal stripes. But in my size, this would be 9 rows and this would be 6 rows. So I really liked the look of this motif on the model. I really liked the spacing and I did not want to change it. There were different things that could have been done. These are especially this and this and this, are very, very basic charts that could have been extended. I did extend this one, I believe. Yeah. This one I extended by 2 to 3 rows to help make up the difference. Because again, you just have like a lace, and every other stitch, a checkerboard, a lace, whatever you want to call it. Neither of those are correct. Because they both have different spacing. But basically a colorwork moss stitch is all that's happening here. So I extended that further. And so therefore made up a few rows that way. But what I really ended up doing is adding another motif right there to get the extra depth that I needed by eliminating these rows and these rows. So it's very easy in this style of chart or stranded colorwork because there's only 2 colors. So if you're looking to make modifications, it is much easier in this situation. And there are wonderful resources in the world. Alice Starmore's book of Fair Isle Knitting has a ton of these little period patterns, and she has them sorted by row, or yeah, compiled by row. So if you need 8 rows, you go to this section. If you need just 2 rows, you go to this 2 or 3 rows, 2, 3. So she has them compiled that way, which is an amazing resource. And then of course you get bigger motifs as well. So that is by Alice Starmore. You can also find lots and lots of different motifs. This is 150 Scandinavian motifs by Mary Jane Mucklestone. And again, these are not ordered by size, but they're very clearly given to you. This is 17 rows and 10 stitches. So it's very easy to look for things that you need. And then the last one is 200 Fair Isle Motifs, but also by M.J. Mucklestone. So, and again, a similar, this one has the color pictures up front, and then again is written by rows. These are 4 rows, these are 5, these are 7. These are my 2 favorite resources, but certainly that works as well. And these are typically going to be available in libraries because they are sort of reference canon. So check there if you want to try them out first. But so that's all I did. I knew that I wanted, you know, about X number of rows that we needed to make up. And so that's what I looked for. And ultimately what I decided to do, which I thought was kind of fun of me, I did this little 2x1. So one every other stitch, and then there are 2 rows. So there's 2 rows and 2 rows. They're staggered. Okay. And the reason that worked out really well for me is that the other thing I changed is that the short rows, kudos for having their short rows in there, but the short rows were written to be solid. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with having a solid band here at all, but I thought, well, if I'm adding a motif up there that I actually could do with short rows, then why not? And this one worked out perfectly. So I was able to do my color work, my short rows with the stranded color work, so that, as you can see, you know, this motif is, let's see, I can't count because the light is coming in funny, but it's much deeper here than it is here, right? So I think this is like 4 rows and this is something like 12. Because again, I added all those short rows in with that shaping. And you know, you kind of, because your short row is 2 rows essentially, a motif that's 2 rows deep works out really well for working into short rows, because it just does, because you're going back and forth. You know, multiples of 2. 4 would work as well, but you know, again, this worked really well, and I think it's fun to have that little extra bit of striping back there and not just a solid band. But that's just personal preference more than anything else. Okay, so then let's talk about how I transferred from a pullover to a cardigan. And then this might be generally helpful if you're planning to do the same. So this pattern, of course, is written from the bottom up. So as written, you do not bind off for the neckband. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. It just depends on the designer and what they're doing. Benefits to binding off for the neckband is that it can give you a little bit more structure. It does give you a little bit more structure if that's something that you need. And I often do like to do that. Let me rephrase that. I don't like to do it. But I typically do like how it works, or how it looks after you're done. Because again, I'm constantly aware of how heavy my garment is versus, you know, the 36-inch that might be photographed on the model. And one thing that can happen with grading to plus size, now it's gotten much better in recent years. But when I first started knitting, it was a straight percentage grade. So if my bust was 50% bigger than the smallest bust size, they made my neckline 50% bigger. Typically that's not the case. I might need a bigger neckline, but it doesn't typically need to be 50% bigger than the smaller size. Now that has gotten much better in recent years. But it is always something that's in my mind, especially when I'm working with from a pattern of a designer that I don't know, where the schematic is not given. So being aware of that and looking at the numbers for the neckline of the smallest size versus my size, I was a little bit concerned that it might be a more open neckline than I really wanted. And that's totally a matter of personal preference, but I tend to like my sweaters farther up on my shoulder. It just makes, especially if I'm wearing them as a cardigan, it keeps them from slipping off as much, especially with a yoke versus a set-in sleeve. I find that that's much more helpful for me in fit. So, so that's all to say that I did bind off for the neckline. I then steeked my sweater, as I talked about in a regular episode, but in case you didn't see it, I did do a slip stitch crochet reinforcement for my steek. I said that I had recently picked up a sweater that I hadn't worn for a few years and looked at it and realized that I had done the slip stitch reinforcement for the steek, and that it looked very tidy and had held up really well. Again, that was a woolen spun yarn. I may not be as confident with it with a superwash or like a worsted spun yarn, but it looked so much tidier than my particular sewn reinforced bind-offs. So I decided to do a slip stitch. I'm very happy with it. So you just do a slip stitch on either side of the bars that you're going to cut. The great thing is you don't have to get a sewing machine out. You don't have to worry about whether your thread is going to match. You just use the thread you used. It's lovely. And you can do it while you're watching Shrill. You don't have to, get a machine out and be secluded in another room or what have you. So I did just do that for my steek, and I'm very pleased with it. Obviously, I've only worn the sweater a few times, but given the other sweater, I think it's going to be lovely. And if for some reason I see that it's slipping or pulling out, I can always go along and whip stitch it with a thread if I'm getting nervous about it. But overall, doesn't it look sweet? It looks good. Some of my sewn bind-offs lately have been messy enough that I felt like I needed to cover them with ribbon, which I don't really like to do at all. A, it's expensive. Ribbon that's cute is surprisingly expensive. But B, it affects the elasticity of your sweater. Sorry guys, since we have the new guy, he's way more alert of the cats and the humans that might be in front of our house at some distance. Okay, so grosgrain or ribbon in general. So yeah, and then of course also it's just like an extra step to have to tie this to stitch the thing down and all, and to find the ribbon that's going to work. So it's just a hassle, and if I don't have to do it, then I don't want to. That's not to say that it's not a great, lovely thing, and I would never say to somebody not to do it. But if I don't have to, then I don't want to. So that's the steek. So, okay, so then I steeked it, and then I picked up for my neckband and knit my neckband. Now, what happened to me was when I knit my neckband, I did the typical pickup. So on a yoke, you don't have rows versus stitches. You don't have a horizontal versus a vertical pickup issue because it's all there. But so I did a 1-to-1 pickup and knit the collar, bound off, and it was super ruffly. So what I did is that I went ahead, picked up 3 for $4 like I would for a button band, and now it's fine. So I don't know if that was just a difference between my gauge for the stranded technique versus, of course, this is just regular ribbing, or if it was in fact that maybe there were more stitches here than I needed, and so just picking up 3 for $4 was like doing an extra decrease row and just bringing it in the amount I needed. Neither here nor there. It was not a big deal to rip it out and then redo it. So did that, and then I picked up 3 for $4 for my button bands and did my button bands. What I do is I do the band that your buttons will be attached to first. And typically what I do is, even if it's a pattern that's written as a cardigan, I always pick my buttons before I do my buttonholes. And in fact, usually before I do the band, because I hate the thought, again, buttons are very expensive and can add quite a bit of cost to the sweater. Even inexpensive ones can be pricey, especially if you're like me and you like to have a very close button placement. Usually I know that I'm going to need 25% more buttons than is written in the pattern, at least, because that's just how I like my buttons to be spaced. What was I going to say? Oh, so I pick my buttons first, and then I knit my button band to the button itself. So now I usually, I do typically go for an approximate size. If it is a cardigan, I go to an approximate, like if it's written for a 2-inch button, then I'm going to be looking for that neighborhood. But if I find a 1 3/4 inch button that I really dig, I don't want to have to pass it by because my buttonholes will be sized incorrectly or what have you, or my band will be sized incorrectly. So I always pick my buttons first. So I picked up 3 for $4 for my button band, knit it. I typically would have given myself at least another row, probably 2, but I was very tight on yarn. I almost had to go in, I only had maybe 5 meters at the most before I needed to go into my swatch. So I knew, ultimately that's what happened. But as I was doing the button band, I was very aware that I was very tight on yarn. So I normally would have made this button band at least 1 row, probably 2 rows deeper, but it's fine the way it is. You just need to have at least a row on either side of your wooden button plus your bind off is kind of my general rule of thumb. So I did that. And then what I do is I lay my sweater to determine how many buttons I need and where my buttonholes go. I just lay my sweater out and then space the buttonholes like I like them. Now, typically what I try to do is these are all centered over the purl 2 ridge. I typically try to maintain something like that for my own peace of mind. So I don't usually try to do like these over the purl row and then these over a knit row, because I will if I have to, but I don't like to. So I just lay them out how I like them, and then usually what I go back and do is use a coilless stitch marker, like a coilless safety pin, and mark where I've put the buttons so that it's there permanently, and so that when I do my buttonholes, I can keep checking, because I'm always afraid that I'm going to have gotten off and make all my buttonholes incorrectly. And then B, so that when I go to sew on my buttons, I know exactly where to sew them on. So that's usually what I do. And so then I've figured out where I need my buttonholes, and then I go ahead and cast on for my other side. Make sure my stitch count matches. You don't want it to be different. Make sure my stitch count matches, and then go from there. So usually I like to work my buttonhole. I do a 1 row buttonhole, which is my favorite, and I work it on the wrong side of the fabric. And that's personal preference, I think. Usually it's written to be worked on the right side, but I just like the way it looks when worked from the wrong side a bit better. And that may be a factor of it being centered over purls versus knits. I don't know. But usually I wait to figure out how big my buttonhole needs until I do my first buttonhole. Now that may mean that you have to, like for example, I thought I might only need 2 stitches for this buttonhole, but I ended up needing 4. So I worked my first buttonhole with 2 stitches and I was like, oh, nope, that's not gonna work. Took it apart. That's another great thing about a 1 row buttonhole. You're only committed to that first buttonhole before you move on. So then I did a 3 stitch one. Nope, still too small. Did a 4 stitch one. The 4 stitch is snug. I do like my buttonholes to be snug, but it's not undoable. And the reason I like them to be snug is so that they don't stretch out as much, because usually I like it to be a little bit firm so that it's not going to be like all loosey-goosey. Okay. And so, But that's to say I did have to, instead of saying, oh, my 2-stitch buttonhole is going to be right over this purl bump, I did have to back it up and go 1 stitch of the rib of the knit rib, 2 stitches of the purl, and then a knit stitch of the next rib. So I did have to back it up a little bit, but that's not really a problem because you still know, oh, I'm going to center it over these places. So it's not hard to make the difference. Like, okay, I know I'm going to need 2 of these before I get into the buttonhole. So, and again, it's great to have those markers there so that you don't lose track and you can always check to feel like you're okay. So yeah. Oh, and I would have probably done another row on my buttonhole band as well, or another 2 perhaps. But again, my yarn was very tight. So you can see that my buttonhole is slightly off center with preference to leaning this way. And that's generally, if you need to make your buttonhole off center, make this side wider. So make the outside edge wider. That's just so that when you button it, you're covering the underneath one. You don't want to have the underneath one showing through. Does that make sense? And really, I mean, it's a row off, but nobody's going to notice. Okay, so that's adding buttonholes and buttonhole bands and things like that to a pullover. And so that is to say also that I do usually use a lot more buttons. I said that briefly before, but just for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 buttons on this sweater for me. I definitely would not want any fewer. I don't know why. It's just aesthetically what I like, I guess. I very, very rarely button all these buttons, but I do like to have the 3 to 4 right around the bust line to be close enough together that they're not going to gap. And so that usually does involve a smaller spacing. But that's just how I like to wear my sweaters. So that means I have to put all those buttons on or it might look kind of wonky. And so, yeah, if you want to know more about the single row buttonhole, I think I'll do a little just technique. There's tons of other videos out there, but if you don't know that that's a thing to look for, you might not look for it. So I think I will do a single row buttonhole like introduction, just a real short video later this month, just so you have it in your brain that that is something that's available to you as a buttonhole option. But when I have to look it up every time I do it because you can only do it once a sweater, like you only do 1 buttonhole row per sweater. And you don't always do cardigans. So I do have to look it up every time. And what I usually use as my refresher is Isolde Teague has a single row buttonhole. It's illustrated, so you don't have to watch a video. It's very concise. It all fits on one screen, like on your iPad or your phone or whatever, which I really like. I don't want to have to move around a bunch of all the steps because I just need a refresher. So I think that's a great one if you do need a refresher. I don't know if you're working from the ground up and never having done one, if it would be enough information. I think it would, but you might feel more comfortable with another resource that has a little bit more meat to it, I guess. But I always utilize that one for my refresher. I think it's the best. So yeah, so that's my after party. I really dig it. I don't think I actually mentioned what yarn it was. I apologize. This is Bartlett Yarns Sport Weight yarn. The pattern is written for fingering, but my gauge was very similar. Fingering to sport, it's not much difference. I'm sorry, I'm distracted. There's both a robin and a goldfinch out my window, which is very exciting. But so this is terracotta, and then this colorway I did not have a name on it, but it's just a wheat color. And I really can't say enough about this yarn. I really dig it. It's a really good price point. I figured out, yes, here we go. My project cost, not with the buttons, because I didn't think to add that, was $60 before tax or shipping. So I did buy it at New York Sheep and Wool, so I did pay sales tax on it. But if I bought it from home, it would have been $75 with the shipping, which for me is a great price point for a cardigan for somebody that's my size. Of course, this is a situation where this price would actually be the true for everybody because the cone yarn is a cone. And I purchased 1 cone of the background color and 1 skein of the contrast color. So yeah, anybody up to a size 56-inch bust would be a $60 sweater for materials only. So I hope that is helpful, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye.